Hello friends, and welcome to our video lecture on topic D4.1 natural selection. Our guiding questions are: what processes can cause changes in allele frequencies within a population, and what is the role of reproduction in the process of natural selection? Our objectives: we are going to explain natural selection, talk about some of the sources of variation in a population that are required for natural selection to occur. We're going to talk about lots and lots of selection pressures, abiotic and biotic, density dependent, density independent. We're going to talk about biological fitness, talk about why traits must be inheritable in order for evolution to occur. We're going to talk about one more kind of selection pressure, that being mating preference, and then we're going to wrap up with a look at Endler's simulation of natural selection in guppies. Remember that evolution is the change in inherited traits in a population over time. We can also define it as the change in allele frequencies within a population over time. One of the mechanisms by which evolution can occur is natural selection. In order for natural selection to drive evolution, these four conditions must be met. The first one, we need to have more offspring being produced than can be supported by the environment. Remember way back in topic C4.1, populations and communities, we looked at this sigmoidal growth curve. We talked about how population numbers will increase rapidly until we get to carrying capacity. Sometimes the population number can overshoot that carrying capacity, and that's when competition comes into play. Because there is some kind of variation amongst the organisms in a population, some are better suited for the environment, and therefore they can outcompete the other members of the species. The traits that are going to enable some organisms to outcompete the traits that are beneficial, those adaptations, are more likely going to be passed on to offspring because the organisms that are outcompeting the others are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. Here's an example of a super interesting case of natural selection. We're looking at rock pocket mice here. They live in southwestern United States. We've got some variation in the fur colors of these mice. They range from pretty light to pretty dark. Sometimes more offspring are being produced than can be supported by the environment that these mice are living in. Because of the variation, some of the mice are more able to outcompete the others. This guy living in the sandy parts of the southwestern United States is able to outcompete this guy because it's camouflaged. Predators are more likely to spot this guy, more likely to eat that guy. This guy is less likely to survive and reproduce and pass on that darker colored fur to its offspring. And so this is going to be selected for by the environment. Except what's crazy cool about this environment is that these swaths of desert sand are interrupted by these lava flows. And the lava flows, this igneous rock, crazy darker. And so right next to the sandy space where the lighter colored mice are better adapted for the environment, we have these lava flows where being a darker colored mouse is more likely to be a benefit. And so this sympatric speciation we think is occurring because these guys are not going to interbreed so much because they're not going to venture out into the sandy spaces where they're more likely to get eaten. The lighter colored mice are less likely to find themselves on the lava flows because they're more likely to get eaten because now they're not camouflaged, while the darker mice are. So where does that variation come from so that natural selection can drive evolution? There are three main sources of variation within a species. You need to memorize all three. Number one is mutation. Of course, mutations are going to result in new alleles. New alleles in a population is variation. Number two is meiosis, especially in prophase 1 and metaphase 1. Remember that in prophase 1 we have crossing over those homologous pairs of chromosomes. Chromosomes that have the same genes but not necessarily the same alleles are going to trade chunks, so that we have a mixing up of alleles from the previous generation being passed on to the next. In metaphase 1, our homologous pairs of chromosomes are going to line up in all kinds of random ways. The law of independent assortment says that I'm not going to have all the chromosomes that I got from my mom on one side and all the chromosomes that I got from my dad on the other side, but instead we're going to have a lovely random assortment of how these guys line up in metaphase 1. That's going to lead to many, many unique gametes, genetically unique gametes at the end of meiosis. Sexual reproduction is our final source of variation. The human male can produce between 100 and 300 million sperm cells every single day. Only one or a very few of them are actually going to ever fertilize an egg, and so this brilliant randomness of which sperm gets to the egg first is going to lead to even more variation. Once we have that variation within a species, different selection pressures within the environment will lead to some traits being more advantageous than others. We'll have some organisms better able to compete in that environment due to that specific selection pressure. Some of our selection pressures are biotic. Remember that this means that they are related to living things. Predators are living things, and so predation is a biotic factor that can be a selection pressure. For example, these are the peppered moths, commonly found in England prior to the Industrial Revolution. It was an advantage to be light colored because the bark of the trees was light colored. And so the selection pressure of birds being better able to spot dark colored moths on the light colored bark led to the pressure to select for lighter colored moths in the population. However, during the Industrial Revolution, what happened was a bunch of coal got burnt and a bunch of pollution, soot started to cover the tree bark. That made the trees darker colored, which meant that the pressure changed. Now it was easier to spot the lighter colored moths because the darker ones were better camouflaged. Super cool thing happening now as we're shifting away from coal burning. Well, the trees are lighter colored again, and so the selection pressure is once again shifting. It's better to be a light colored moth. Similar but sadder, elephants are starting to evolve to be tuskless. Tusks are a benefit. It helps elephants dig to get to water. It helps them fight for mates and to defend their territory. However, poachers, us humans, kill elephants for the tusks. If an elephant doesn't have a tusk, it's less likely to be killed by a poacher. And so the population of elephants, we're seeing more and more elephants surviving without tusks and having babies that don't have tusks. So because of us human poachers, elephants are evolving without tusks. Environmental selection pressures can also be abiotic or not living. Temperature is an example of an abiotic factor that can lead to natural selection. Organisms that mutated to have this trait of hibernation reduced metabolism, leading to a reduced need for food in the winter when it's really hard to find that food under all the snow. These organisms better able to survive those cold winters, more likely to have babies that also hibernated. Access to water is another abiotic factor. Some organisms have super cool adaptations that allow them to store water for really long times. They're more able to survive in places where drought is common. Oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, pressure, if we're talking about marine organisms living especially deep in the water, being able to resist the pressure of all that water is another example of a selection pressure that is abiotic. Selection pressures can also be density dependent or density independent. A few slides ago, I referenced topic C4.1, populations and communities, in which we talked about that carrying capacity idea. We learned about factors that influence population size, what allows a population to grow, and what limits the growth of a population size. These same factors that influence population size can also act as selection pressures. And sometimes those pressures are density dependent. It depends on how many organisms are in the population. Predators, when they have easy access to pick off some prey, are definitely going to choose the ones that are less well adapted, the ones that are easier to find. There are also density-independent factors, these factors that do not depend on how many organisms are in a population. These can also act as selection pressures. We just talked about temperature as an example of an abiotic factor. That can be a selection pressure. It is also density-independent. I've mentioned a few times in this video lecture already the idea of some organisms being more suited for their environment. Some organisms have adaptations that allow them to survive and therefore reproduce, passing those traits on to offspring. This is the concept of biological fitness. Organisms that are better suited for their environment. They have adaptations that allow them to survive and reproduce, passing on those traits. Biological fitness can be a matter of being stronger or faster or bigger, but not always. Let's look at the slightly counterintuitive example of the heterozygote advantage of sickle cell. We learned that sickle cell is a mutation in the hemoglobin protein. People who have sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia, in low oxygen environments, their red blood cells will curl up, leading to clots, lots and lots of blood clots all over the body, which is painful and fatal. What's kind of weird is that the parasite that leads to malaria does not infect red blood cells that carry that hemoglobin mutation that leads to sickle cell. So in areas of the world where malaria is common, people who had no alleles for sickle cell would often die of malaria. People who were homozygous recessive for sickle cell would die of sickle cell. But people who were heterozygous, a little bit of normal hemoglobin, a little bit of sickle cell hemoglobin, would be resistant to malaria. And so being heterozygous for sickle cell would actually make you more resistant to malaria, which meant that you were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on that sickle cell trait. So again, fitness is not necessarily about being stronger, faster, bigger. It can also be having a little bit of sickle cell, which means that you don't die from malaria. And because fitness is all about surviving, reproducing, and passing traits onto your offspring that help them better survive in the environment, only traits that are inheritable are going to be those that influence fitness. So someone who goes to the gym and swims every day, super strong swimmer, it's not necessarily going to be considered more biologically fit. Swimming doesn't mean that we humans are better able to survive in our environment. We're more likely to reproduce because we're good swimmers. So swimming, not going to influence biological fitness. Or does it? Here we have a swimmer of the Bajau tribe. This is a tribe in Southeast Asia. They collect food off of the bottom of the ocean, which means that the better able they are to hold their breaths for long periods of time, the more food they can collect. The more food they collect, the more food they eat, the more fit they are, because if you're well fed, you're more able to survive and make lots of babies. People of the Bajau tribe have spleens that are larger than normal average human spleen sizes. The spleen's job is to filter and store red blood cells. And so having a bigger spleen means more red blood cells, means more hemoglobin, means more oxygen carrying capacity. Because some ancestor of the Bajau tribe happened to be born with a larger spleen, that person was better able to swim deep, hold their breath for longer amounts of time. They were able to collect more food, and because they had more food, they were better nourished, they survived better, they had more babies, and those babies also had bigger spleens. And over many, many, many generations in this tribe, we now have a great majority of the people with much larger spleens, which makes them really good swimmers. And in this particular environment, being a good swimmer does mean you're better able to survive and reproduce, and you pass on that big spleen to your offspring. We've talked a lot about traits that allow an organism to better survive its environment so that it can then reproduce and pass on its traits. But reproduction is also a super important part of that fitness. Let's talk about how sexual selection is a pressure that is going to affect traits in an environment. Here we have a glorious peacock with his magnificent feathers. That plumage, that coloration makes it an easy target for predators. The dance that he does to attract a mate requires a lot of energy. But having those feathers, being able to put on that dance, tells a female that this bird is pretty strong, he's been well nourished, and he is more likely to have good genes to get passed on to the next generation. Organisms need to not just survive, but they also need to be able to attract a mate. Offspring are more likely to inherit these mating behaviors, this magnificent plumage, so that they continue mating, not just surviving. This Canadian scientist, John Endler, did an investigation looking at the interplay between pressures related to survival and pressures related to mate selection and reproduction. He started some ponds with some guppies, these tiny little fish that have spots, and there were initially no predators in any of his ponds. He noticed that over a few generations, the number of spots on the fish increased. Females preferred to mate with males that had more spots, that were more colorful. At one point, Endler began to introduce predators to the ponds. Some of the ponds got cichlids. These cichlids are pretty dangerous predators, and they clearly led to a decrease in the number of spots on the fish because the cichlids were more likely to find and eat the more spotted fish. Therefore, only the duller fish were surviving to reproduce. The rivulus ponds, rivulus is another predator, not as dangerous as the cichlid. Notice that the number of spots continued to increase, even more so than in the control ponds. In these ponds, it was still more important to attract a mate than it was to evade a predator. Super interesting look at how different degrees of predation and different influences of mating selection can lead to such different allele frequencies in these populations of the same species. And on that note, my friends, we have accomplished this video lecture. We talked about processes that cause changes in allele frequencies lead to evolution in a population. We also talked about the role of reproduction in the process of natural selection. We explained natural selection. We talked about those 3 sources of variation. Make sure that you can name them: mutation, meiosis, and sexual reproduction. We talked about abiotic, not living, and biotic selection pressures. We talked about selection pressures being density dependent and density independent. Biological fitness is all about your ability to survive, reproduce, and pass on your traits, and those traits must be inheritable in order for them to get passed on. We talked about mating preference as a selection pressure, and we talked about John Endler's super cool natural selection in guppies investigation. Well done today, my friends.